Hello everyone, welcome to the second part of Module 7. Now I will be talking about range variation, but more specifically, in greater depth, range restriction, which is something that we'll be correcting for in our meta-analyses in Module 8. Alright, so this is a second source of artifactual variance. We might see a correlation or other types of effect sizes being influenced by range variation when we're using variables to calculate it. In an extreme end, if a variable has a zero variance, the variable is actually a constant and will correlate with all other variables. So of course that's the basic gist of a correlation. Likewise, variables with some variance but not much will have correlations of smaller magnitude with other variables. Okay, so again, we're talking about correlations here. So we might look at something in a selection context. So this is something we should all be familiar with since we're professors. We might use something like SAT scores to screen applicants. Okay, and this is something that's employed at some schools, not at others. You know, some grad programs require some selection scores on standardized tests, others don't. At such schools, SAT scores could have a broad range and correlate with other variables. So specifically, colleges that would not use them to screen applicants. In contrast, other schools that use SAT scores in making admissions decisions and only admit those with very high scores. Okay, so this might be like an Ivy League school. In these more selective schools, the SAT would have very little variance and would not be able to correlate with anything. Okay, so we had our basic definition of what we're talking about with a correlation. So in this context, SAT scores would all be, you know, imagine the greatest university on earth only takes people with perfect SAT scores. Well, SAT scores, of course, would not vary, and therefore they could not correlate with, for example, first semester GPA. Okay, now consider the correlation between an employment interview score, okay, so how someone did when they're interviewing, and job performance. To calculate this correlation, one would need a sample of members with scores on both the interview and, of course, job performance. These are two variables of interest. Whereas those with low scores on the interview were not hired. So in this instance, the hire versus not hire decision caused direct range restriction on the interview variance. In other words, only those who scored well on the interview will have both the interview scores and job performance. So we can see here, this is an illustration of range restriction, and we refer to this as direct range restriction, in which there are two variables that you're interested in, and one of them is being cut off. So in this instance, a low cutoff score on a predictor causes little range restriction. You could imagine if we had, this, I just mentioned the interview example, but if we refer to an earlier example of SAT scores and first semester GPA, we could also have range restriction here if we cut off that predictor by that little bit. If we were to imagine our perfect university example where, you know, the university is taking only people with fantastic SAT scores, then we might have, of course, a higher cutoff for the SAT test, or, you know, in the case of selecting someone for an applicant, selecting an applicant for a job, we take only people that have fantastic scores in their interview, we'd have a much larger amount of range restriction. Okay, so variance in variables may also be enhanced under some circumstances. So this is, I would say, a little bit less common. Okay, I should also mention too, with range restriction, on this previous slide, I mentioned that we could have direct range restriction. We also might have what we refer to as indirect range restriction. There's a slightly different way to correct for that. That is, indirect range restriction would be much more common than direct range restriction, because it's very rare that we only have one predictor of one outcome. Typically, for example, in admitting students to a university or hiring someone for a job, we oftentimes have multiple predictor variables. So you may have range restriction with one particular predictor variable to the outcome, but we have indirect range restriction because we're not just using that one predictor to make the decision. It's not as if we say, do you have a perfect SAT score or a perfect interview score, we're going to admit you to this university, or we're going to hire you no matter what else. We're not using any other predictors. Okay, so that's quite rare. Okay, so the other type of range variation is range enhancement. This is definitely still occurs, but it's probably less corrected for. Okay, so in this instance we have I'll give an example of age, a continuous variable. Oftentimes researchers conduct studies using extreme age groups. So you're trying to look at how age could play a role in something. And so to accomplish this, researchers might select members who are either very old or very young. Or I've seen this sometimes in, we'll say, integrity selection tests. Someone might pick nuns and they might pick, convicted criminals, and they might compare nuns versus convicted criminals to see if their test can, predict who is, who's going to perform well in the job and who's going to commit counterproductive work behaviors. Okay, so in the age example, with an extreme group of participants, one would have larger variance, as you might suspect, than a study which used subjects with a full range of employees, full range of aged employees. So this larger variance is sometimes referred to as range enhancement. So correlations calculated from studies with range enhancement would yield larger correlations than a population correlation based on variables with a normal non-range enhanced variance. So previously with range restriction, we have the possibility of attenuating our correlations. Here with range enhancement, we have a chance of reporting larger correlations than what would exist at the population level. Okay, so even without explicit efforts to cause range restriction or range enhancement, studies will vary among each other in range variation. And so this is something that we could actually correct for as we're going through the process of meta-analyzing our samples in Module 8. Okay, so some studies will have somewhat more variance than average in variables of interest. Other studies will have somewhat less variance in the variables of interest. So, for example, if we were to continue with the age theme, the typical standard deviation of age in a sample of employed adults is about 10 years. However, some samples have much larger standard deviations and others much smaller. So, oftentimes if we were to go into a workplace, we might say, okay, yes, typically the standard deviation is 10 years, but we definitely find some workplaces where that's not true, where there's the standard deviation is 15 years versus another workplace where the standard deviation might be only 5 years. Samples with larger age variances will tend to have larger correlations between age and other variables than the sample with smaller age variances. So to correct for range restriction, we oftentimes need to have some sort of reference point in the population. So for example, if we were to use an intelligence test, and we would know that the mean IQ is 100, the standard deviation is 15, and we could say, okay, the standard deviation was only 12 in the study, or it was 20. We know that we have the possibility of range restriction or range enhancement. There are other ways without having a clear reference point depending on the type of scale that you're using, but it is oftentimes less common to see corrections for range restriction, for example, than it is to see corrections for measurement error. You almost never see oftentimes in management literature studies that are corrected for, you almost always see studies that are corrected for measurement error, particularly when we're using survey research, but oftentimes you do not see studies that are corrected for range enhancement or range restriction. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more. Your coding sheet that I gave you would have a way for you to capture range for measurement error. I don't think I included there a column for range restriction. We'll talk about it a little bit more, though, in Module 8. So have a good weekend, everyone.